Hello there. My name is Emily. I am 15 years old, and I live with my mother, Susan, my father, Mark, and my cousin, David. David has been living with us ever since his parents passed away, and he basically became like my brother rather than my cousin. His parents, which would be my aunt and uncle, were both killed due to a terrible mistake. David had been spending the night at his friend's house, and that's the only reason he's probably still alive. His parents had a fire going in their fireplace that night, but they weren't aware that their chimney was blocked. The carbon monoxide from the fire wasn't able to escape through the chimney, so it filled the house. The doctors had said that they probably weren't even aware it happened, that they were probably dizzy and confused before passing out from low oxygen. It was a horrible accident, and I think David sometimes feels like he should have died with them. I can't imagine what that kind of survivor's guilt feels like. My family welcomed him with open arms, as he was my father's sister's son, after all. I know we aren't his actual parents and sister, but we are still a family by blood. It took a while for him to warm up to us, but after a few months, he seemed to come around. I really felt like he was my brother, and I had always wanted a sibling. Then, things started becoming tough in my family. I remember waking up one night to shouting and the sound of fighting. David was still asleep in bed, or he was pretending to sleep and didn't want to deal with whatever was happening. I crept to my door and cracked it open to try and see what was happening. My mother was shouting at my father, while he was standing in front of her, looking more annoyed than angry. After listening for a bit, I was able to determine that my mother had found proof of him cheating. I couldn't believe it, as it always seemed like my parents loved each other very much. I never would have suspected my father would cheat with another woman. After a few more uncomfortable minutes of them shouting and calling each other vicious names, my father eventually stormed out of the house and slammed the front door. I could tell that my mother was fuming, rightfully so. He had stood there and somehow made it seem like it was her fault that he was out there sleeping with other women. I saw my mother grab her phone from the couch after a moment, a determined look on her face. Well, if that's the way he wants to do this, let's see how he likes it, I heard her mutter to herself as she typed out a message on her phone. I wasn't sure, but it seemed like she was talking about sleeping with someone as well to get back at him. I figured she was just really upset and making empty threats. I went back to bed, and I noticed David had been sitting up in bed as well. I guess he had been listening as well, but he didn't say anything before turning over to go back to bed. I felt a heavy feeling of dread in my stomach, feeling as if I had just watched the beginning of the end of my family. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I found comfort in my cousin, as we both kind of felt the shift in the family after that night. My parents fought a whole lot more, and their anger tended to be unfairly transferred toward me. It was really crappy to be used as some sort of weird pawn by my parents against each other. I did my best to just avoid them both, staying in my room or being out of the house during the day. My cousin seemed pretty unimpressed as well, though he might have just been numb to it after losing his own parents. We tended to just stick together, and we became even closer. We'd turn up the stereo during the afternoon to drown out my parents and study together. There was no other way to get a moment of peace otherwise. I was extremely grateful for him, and I found his self-deprecating and sarcastic humor a relief from feeling depressed about everything. One day, when we were hanging out, things took a bit more of a turn than I expected. It was a rare time where both of my parents were out of the house, so there was blissful quiet and peace in the house. We were both just relaxing in our room, making small talk and discussing things like we normally did. I remember that I was about to reply to a question he had asked me when he suddenly kissed me. I felt my brain kind of short-circuit, as it took me completely by surprise. I pulled away a moment to ask him what he was doing, blushing brightly. He told me that he thought I looked particularly kissable in that moment, so he went for it. I felt flustered and confused, knowing very well that he was my cousin. Despite my hesitations, though, I let him kiss me again. After a little while of just exchanging kisses, we wound up getting more intimate together. I know it isn't exactly the most morally correct thing to do, but it all just happened so fast. I barely had time to process what was happening before it was over. I knew I couldn't tell my parents about this. Not that they would even have listened to anything I was saying at this point. It couldn't hurt anyone if no one knew, right? Wrong. It was about a month later that I found out I was pregnant. I felt sick with anxiety, knowing I was still a teen and that the baby was also my cousin's. I didn't hide it from him, though, and I confronted him about the issue. I was a mess of tears and snot when I told him what I found out, but he took it rather well, considering everything. He assured me that he was there to support me, and didn't want the idea of abortion or adoption to be an option. He said he would be there, and I believed him. It took a lot of the stress off of me, and I hoped that we could somehow make this work. I had no idea what I was going to tell my parents. I couldn't just hide it from them forever. They were going to figure out something was up when I started getting bigger, or when I turned up with a baby. For the time, though, I decided to say nothing and hold off on that future conversation. As time went on, I noticed that my mother spent a lot more time with David than she used to. I figured she was trying to get on his good side, in case my parents got a divorce. They had both been trying to do that with me as well, so I didn't think anything of it. I just hoped she would actually treat him like a son, rather than a playable piece in their mind games. He seemed happier when he spent time with her, and I was hoping that he was starting to feel more comfortable in our home. I didn't suspect anything was up. One Friday, after I had walked all the way to dance class to practice for a recital, I came to the studio to find it had been canceled last minute. I was so annoyed because my ankles were starting to get kind of swollen, and I had to walk all the way there just to walk right back home. I was in a really bad mood as I headed back home, trying to get myself to calm down so I didn't snap at anyone. I entered the house, which was oddly quiet, and just went straight up to my room to cool off. When I opened my door, however, I began to scream. Right there, in my cousin's bed, was David and my mother. They weren't sitting together having a nice little family chit-chat either. I felt lightheaded, and like I was floating for a moment, I guess having gone into shock. Then everything becomes a bit of a blur after that. I had passed out on the floor of the room apparently, and they had to rush me to the hospital. I fell into a coma, and they weren't sure when I would wake up. It took a little over a month for me to wake up from my coma, and the first sight I was greeted with was my mother's face. That was the last thing I wanted to deal with right then, but I was too weak to argue with her or ask her to leave. She began bawling and begging me not to tell my father about what I had seen. I was still a bit confused about everything, having just come out of a month-long coma. But after I finally got my mind together, I decided to agree. It wasn't so much I was protecting my mother, but that I didn't want to tell my father and ultimately lose David if my dad became enraged. A few minutes after our agreement, my father walked into the room as well to see me. He looked delighted, grasping onto my hand and telling me he was glad I was okay. He then told me that they had a surprise they had been waiting to tell me. He said that I was going to have a new baby sibling, and that my mother was pregnant. I thought I was going to pass out all over again when I heard the news. I gave them an extremely fake smile, but they probably just thought I was still confused from my coma. I felt so much sadness in that one moment. It took a couple of days of observation before I was finally released from the hospital. Thankfully, they hadn't told my parents about my pregnancy due to the privacy laws they had. When I got home, I immediately noticed that David wasn't there. I asked them where he was, and my father told me that he just kind of disappeared after I fell into my coma. I wasn't really sure how to feel about that, but it definitely stung. I was starting to become noticeably bigger, but my parents hadn't caught on to anything yet. They probably thought I was putting on weight quickly after not eating much in the hospital for a month. My dad looked so much happier with my mother, doting over her and the new baby they were expecting. One day, while I was sitting in the living room, my father came home and gave me a gift. Maybe it was pregnancy hormones or guilt, but I broke down when he did. I came clean about everything, unable to keep it inside me anymore. I was honest about me and David, my pregnancy, what I saw before I went into my coma. It felt so good to get it off my chest, but I could see the expression of a purely crushed man on my father's face. It was literally no time before my parents were finalizing a divorce. My mother immediately kicked me out of the house, blaming me for her divorce. I tried to go to my dad, but he refused to help me. I felt completely abandoned and alone, destined to live on the street somewhere with a baby. I got a call on my phone, however, and was both mildly relieved and upset to see it was David. I answered the phone, and I could hear the relief in his voice as he spoke to me. He said he had tried to find out when I had come out of my coma, but was restricted from seeing me in the hospital by my mother. Apparently, my mother had threatened him into silence so no one would find out what had happened. I had no other choice but to let him help me, as the other option would be finding a shelter somewhere to sleep in. He had seemed extremely genuine when he picked me up, though, and I slowly began to trust him again. I haven't talked to either of my parents since, and I live with David now. I'm happy to say that I gave birth to a healthy little girl, who we decided to name Arya.